भगवते वासुदेवाय। ॐ नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय। नारायणं नमस्कृत्य नरं चैव नरोत्तमं देवीं सरस्वतीं व्यासं ततो जयमुदीरयेत्। नष्टप्रायेष्वभद्रेषु नित्यं भागवत सेवया भगवति उत्तमश्लोके भक्तिर्भवति नैष्ठिकी। कृष्णे स्वधामोपगते धर्मज्ञानादिभिः सह कलौ नष्टदृशामेष पुराणार्को धुनोदितः। ग्रंथराज श्रीमद् भागवतम की जय। This is Canto 5, Chapter 5, entitled Lord Rishabhadeva's Teachings. This morning we will speak from text number 14. Karnamashayam Hridaya Granthi Bandham Avidyaya Asaditam Apramattah Anena Yogena Yatha Upadesham Samyak Vyapohya Uparameta Yogat Karmashayam Hridaya Granthi Bandham Avidyaya Saditam Apramattah Anena Yogena Yathopadesham Samyak Vyapohyo Parameta Yogat Karmashayam Hridaya Granthi Bandham Avidyaya Saditam Apramattah Anena Yogena Yathopadesham Samyak Vyapohyo Parameta Yogat Karmashayam Hridaya Granthi Bandham Avidyaya Saditam Apramattah Anena Yogena Yathopadesham Samyak Vyapohyo Parameta Yogat
Karmashayam Hridaya Granthi Bandham
Karmashayam Hridaya Granthi Bandham Avidyaya Saditam Apramattah Anena Yogena Yathopadesham Samyak Vyapohyo Parameta Yogat Karmashayam Hridaya Granthi Avidyaya Saditam Apramattah Anena Yogena Yathopadesham Samyak Vyapohyo Parameta Ladies. Karamashayam, the desire for fruitive activities. Hridaya Granthi, the knot in the heart. Bandham, bondage. Avidyaya, because of ignorance. Asaditam, brought about. Apramattaha, not being covered by ignorance or illusion. Very careful. Anena, by this. Yogena, practice of yoga. Yatha upadesham, as advised. Samyak, completely. Vyapohya, becoming free from. Uparamet, one should desist. Yogat, from the practice of yoga, the means of liberation. Translation by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. As I have advised you, my dear sons, you should act accordingly. Be very careful. By these means, you will be freed from the ignorance of the desire for fruitive activity. And the knot of bondage in the heart will be completely severed. For further advancement, you should also give up the means. That is, you should not become attached to the process of liberation itself. Please repeat. As I have advised you, my dear sons, you should act accordingly. Be very careful. By these means, you will be freed from the ignorance of the desire for fruitive activity, and the knot of bondage in the heart will be completely severed. For further advancement, you should also give up the means. That is, you should not become attached to the process of liberation itself. Purport by Srila Prabhupada. The process of liberation is Brahma Jignasa, the search for the absolute truth. Generally, Brahma Jignasa is called Neti Neti, the process by which one analyzes existence to search out the absolute truth. This method continues as long as one is not situated in his spiritual life. Spiritual life is Brahmabhuta, the self-realized state. In the words of Bhagavad Gita 18:54, Brahmabhuta prasannatma na shochiti na kankshati samahas sarveshu bhuteshu madbhaktim labhate param. One who is thus transcendentally situated at once realizes the Supreme Brahman and becomes fully joyful. He never laments nor desires to have anything. He is equally disposed to every living entity. In that state, he attains pure devotional service unto me. The idea is to enter into the Parabhakti, the transcendental devotional service of the Supreme Lord. To attain this, one must analyze one's existence. But when one is actually engaged in devotional service, he should not bother seeking out knowledge. By simply engaging in devotional service undeviatingly, one will always remain in the liberated condition. Mam chayo vyabhicharena bhakti yogena sevate sagunan samatityaitan brahmapuyaya kalpate. The unflinching execution of devotional service is in itself brahmabhuta. Another important feature in this connection is anena yogena yathopadesham. The instructions received from the spiritual master must be followed immediately. One should not deviate from or surpass the instructions of the spiritual master. One should not be simply intent on consulting books, but should simultaneously execute the spiritual master's order, yathopadesham. Mystic power should be achieved to enable one to give up the material conception. But when one actually engages in devotional service, one does not need to practice the mystic yoga system. The point is that one can give up the practice of yoga, but devotional service cannot be given up. As stated in the Srimad Bhagavatam, Atma ramascha munayo nirgrantha api urukrame kurvanti ahetakim bhaktim itham bhuta guno harihi. Even those who are liberated, Atma Rama, must always engage in devotional service. One may give up the practice of yoga when one is self-realized, but at no stage can one give up devotional service. All other activities for self-realization, including yoga and philosophical speculation, may be given up, but devotional service must be retained at all times. Om Ajnanatimirandhasya Gnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Sthapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamahyam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guroho Shri Uttapada Kamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunathan Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadhutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakhanvitamscha. He Krishna Karuna Sindho Dinabandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanusute Devi Pranamami Haripriye Vancha kalpatarubhyascha kripa sindhubhya eva cha patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha. Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Srivasari Gaur Bhakta Vrinda. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Karmashrayam Hridaya Granthi Bandham Avidyaya Saditam Apramattaha Anena Yogena Yathopadesham Samya Yapohyo Parameta Yogat. As I've advised you, my dear sons, you should act accordingly. Be very careful. By these means, you will be freed from the ignorance of the desire for fruitive activity, and the knot of bondage in the heart will be completely severed. For further advancement, you should also give up the means. That is, you should not become attached to the process of liberation itself. In this verse, of course, according to Srila Jiva Goswami, this verse is it's a kind of a reiteration of the previous 4 verses which we heard yesterday. Very crisp, essential, pithy instructions given by the personality of Godhead. Famous verses. This whole chapter, it's actually, every verse can be memorized. It's a little bit like the 2nd chapter of the 1st canto. Almost every single verse there is very often quoted by Srila Prabhupada, and the same thing is true in this verse, in this chapter. So he's referring to the previous instructions that they've just received. And there's a couple of things that are very prominent. Srila Prabhupada's purport, first of all, he is focusing on what it actually means to become liberated. No one becomes liberated, practically speaking, without very seriously giving thought to the process of how to do so. And that's called Brahma Jignasa. Everyone who chants Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, has already noticed that there is a process of self-introspection that should accompany this chanting. And that's called Brahma Jignasa. We're trying to understand who we are as opposed to who we aren't. That is the essential entry level to Krishna consciousness. And Prabhupada, following Srila Jiva Goswami and following Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, has quoted Bhagavad Gita chapter 18 in order to demonstrate the importance of this principle, that first and foremost, bhakti has to be performed on the liberated platform. There are different kinds of devotional service. Not all kinds of devotional service are transcendental. Some kinds of devotional service are mundane. That's called prakrita bhakti. And it's performed by those that we therefore also call prakrita sahajiyas. Those who assume that 2 things. Number 1, they assume that which is actually mundane is something transcendental. And then going along with that the 2 are inseparable. They also assume that which is actually transcendental is simply mundane. So they not only remain attached to material existence by the practice of that mundane bhakti, but they also are likely to commit offenses, if not to the personality of Godhead, then to the devotees, because they take them to be mundane. So this is a great danger. So Prabhupada is therefore emphasizing that you've got to be a little bit introspective in the beginning, and you have to make a serious endeavor to be liberated, which is to say that you have to perform devotional service on the platform of liberation instead of on the prakrita platform, instead of on the mundane platform. So that is the importance of this verse from Bhagavad Gita. Brahmabhuta, having become purely spirit, Prasannatma, he realizes that he's essentially joyful already. Na shochati na kangshati. The symptoms of this are that he doesn't whine or cry or complain, and he also doesn't hanker after something that he doesn't have, or something that others do have. Sama sarveshu bhuteshu. Because of that, he or she is able to see all other living beings equally. There's no more any calculation of profit or loss in terms of karma and gyan for one's own independent benefit. One is no longer putting some of it south. One is giving everything to Krishna. So therefore he can be non-envious and see all living beings equally. Until we're non-envious, we cannot see anyone equally. And until we're liberated, we also should not see everyone equally. This is an important point that Srila Prabhupada emphasizes in his commentary on Ishopanishad. Those verses that emphasize the spiritual equality of all living beings Prabhupada in his purport very carefully qualifies that one cannot artificially try to apply this principle when one is in fact not actually liberated from material interests, because then it only results in exploitation. In India we have the caste system, which represents the perverse exploitation of dharma. And in the Western countries we have also another kind of caste system, but it's based on the concept of democracy instead. And they're both equally cheating and destructive and illusory. Therefore, avidyaya sadhitam apramatta, one should be unbewildered. One should not be carried away by illusion. Actually, the word asadhita means put down. We should not be kept down by the illusions that we have. Illusions that Krishna calls in Bhagavad Gita chapter 7, Dvandva moha. Anybody know the verse I'm thinking about? Yesham tvandagatam papam jananam punya karmanam te dvandva moha niramukta. They're freed from dvandva moha. They're apramatta. They're liberated, in other words, through piety, through dharma. Dharma has that purpose. So when we make advancement in Krishna consciousness, if we choose to do so, because it's an option that you never make advancement. It is an option. And there are many different options of devotional service, even here in Vrindavan. If you're not interested in liberation, liberation meaning Brahmabhuta liberation. If you're interested only in, say, Salokya liberation, you're living on the same planet with the Lord, living in the same place as the Lord, then, you can be a monkey and have that liberation. You can be a pig and have that liberation. You don't require the form of a gopi in order to practice that mode of devotional service. So we have to think very carefully about these things. Anyway, so the first thing that Prabhupada is emphasizing here is that we have to recognize the necessity of becoming liberated if we're actually interested in performing real devotional service, because Krishna calls it here, Mad Bhaktim Labhate Param. Param means something higher, transcendental devotional service. If we want to come to real devotional service as opposed to simply probate bhakti, that is to say, devotional service with training wheels, or devotional service which is performed under the sponsorship of somebody who's actually Krishna conscious, even though I'm not. This is why we have spiritual masters, because what's our access otherwise? When we're coming at an entry-level Krishna consciousness, we've got no assets in the spiritual world. Why should anyone there pay any attention to us? Only if we receive the recommendation and the blessings of somebody who's actually dear to Krishna. Krishna Preshta, as we sing to Srila Prabhupada every morning. So Prabhupada therefore begins his second paragraph. The idea is to enter into this para bhakti, the transcendental devotional service of the Lord. There are certain shibboleths that we find, certain jargon that we find again and again and again throughout Srila Prabhupada's books. And this is one of them. He says, for example, transcendental loving service. How many times have we heard this? Raise your hand if this is a familiar phrase. Transcendental loving service. So what is Prabhupada saying in that one phrase? Generally the scholars translate the word bhakti, one word, they give it a one-word translation. Devotion. Right? Simple. But actually the easiest words in Sanskrit are the hardest words in Sanskrit. You cannot translate this term, bhakti, very easily. Just like the word rasa. Everybody knows what rasa means, but none of us know what rasa means. Everybody knows what is karma, but it's a difficult topic, Krishna says in Bhagavad Gita. Even the wise are bewildered trying to figure out what is really action, what's inaction, and what's transcendental action. And karma means that essentially, and at least technically speaking, it means the same thing as dharma. And that, of course, is another word that we cannot translate into the English language. Maybe some other languages. Certainly I think you don't really need to translate it in South Asian languages. People already have some concept. But in non-Vedic languages, the word dharma or any other word that subsumes all of its range of meanings, it doesn't exist. And the reason it doesn't exist is because there's not much need for that word. Because there's not, the concept that would require that word is not there. You see the point? Therefore, Srila Prabhupada is hammering on all these things again and again and again. So transcendental and then loving service means it's beyond liberated bhakti. Here in this verse, we're talking about attaining para bhakti. That means to say we're not practicing prakrita bhakti anymore. We're practicing real bhakti on the liberated platform, but there's more than that. You can go deep into this para bhakti. And that means you're going into these 12 rasas. 5 primary and 7 secondary rasas. You're going deeply into what does it mean to be das. Every one of us takes the name das, or better yet, dasi. To be a servant, or even a slave, you can say. Dasa. So, dasya bhakti is not something very easily comprehended by the conditioned mind. What to speak of Sakya Bhakti or Vatsalya Bhakti, or the highest thing is Madhurya Bhakti. We have to be very careful because, especially here in Vrindavan, there's no dearth of persons who are ready to provide us with all manner of infotainment in the realm of so-called Madhurya Rasa. But it's actually really infotainment only. It's meant to give pleasure to the mind only. Because until one is actually practicing this para-bhakti, one cannot enter these things, very easily at least. Only by mercy. So there's a few other things we can say about this. First of all, Srila Prabhupada points out, apparently contradictory thing, that if one is simply engaged in devotional service, then he's automatically liberated and doesn't have to worry or doesn't have to endeavor separately to become liberated. So this seems to be a contradiction of what we've just described, what Prabhupada himself has just encouraged. So who can explain that? How can we unravel this apparent quandary here? Anybody have any sagacious ideas? Yeah. Liberation has begun. We heard the other day, or there's a nice analogy given by one of my godbrothers. When you step into the elevator and push a button of a particular floor, you're going to that floor. Unless the elevator breaks down, you're going to go to that floor. And when you get to that floor, then the door opens. Now you have a choice. You can remain standing in the elevator, or you can step outside of the elevator. If you step outside of the elevator, you have attained your goal. If you remain in the elevator, who knows where you're going next? So bhakti is like that. We are liberated just by dint of performing devotional service. But we've got to make choices in devotional service. We have to decide, what kind of devotional service am I interested in attaining? And we have to cultivate that. That's called sadhana. Now, this is another significant point here, because in the next line of the verse here, he says, Anena yogina yathopadesham. And the acharyas, Srila Prabhupada has based his purport mainly on the commentary of Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur. And Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, like Jiva Goswami, has given great emphasis to this point. What does it actually mean? He says, Yathopadesham yogena gurupadesham anatikramya yoga upayas tenana panditya balat pustaka darshana matrareva svot prekshitena karmanyashirate yasmin tam bandham vyapohya nirasya yogat upayat viramed iti. When we talk about, we have to talk about with our means of liberation, with our means of advancing, we have to also talk about what is the goal of that advancement. We have three things in Krishna consciousness by the grace of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. We have Sambandha, and we have Abhidheya, and we have Prayojana. And they all have to be considered at the same time. If you try to perform devotional service without Sambandha Gyan, then your devotional service remains on the mundane platform, and you do not get the Prayojana. Devotional service, the practice of devotional service is actually called Abhidheya, to carry out the service of the Lord. But it requires some preliminary realization. As we were discussing earlier, one has to be liberated, for example. And one also has to understand things in the proper perspective. One cannot make the mistake of thinking that the Jiva and the Supreme Personality of Godhead are absolutely one and the same, for example. Because that will kill bhakti and it's dead in the water. So some basic understanding has to be there. That's called Sambandha Gyan. Then armed with that Gyan, or Yathopadesham, what we have been instructed by the spiritual master, then we can attempt to engage in devotional service under his direction. And we should direct that devotional service to our specific prayojana, whatever particular devotional service we would like to attain, or whatever devotional service the spiritual master wants. That's the ultimate thing. So the process of bhakti it's automatic liberation, but only if we actually engage fully. So what does it mean to be fully engaged? What does it actually mean to be practically engaged in devotional service? We have to open up the Brihad Bhagavatamritam of Sanatana Goswami and study the examples that he's given there only for our own benefit. The Brihad Bhagavatamrita, it's the great nectar of the Bhagavatam. We are interested in the Srimad Bhagavatam. Srimad Bhagavatam Pramanamamalam Premapum Artho Mahan. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's philosophy is that we have nothing to learn from any source other than the Srimad Bhagavatam. So Sanatana Goswami has therefore very kindly culled from that Srimad Bhagavatam what is the essential nectar that we are supposed to derive benefit from. The essential nectar of the Bhagavatam is the devotees within the Bhagavatam. Those who are exemplary, of course, because not all the devotees in the Bhagavatam are exemplary. Some of them are teaching us what not to do, others are teaching us what to do. So in the Brihad Bhagavatamritam, he gives examples of successive stages of more and more and more refined parabhakti among the great souls who are already liberated. One devotee goes to, for example, Hanuman, and Hanuman says, no, I'm not really a devotee. You want to see a real devotee, you have to visit the Pandavas. And then he goes to the Pandavas and they point him to someone else. And they point him to someone else and someone else until ultimately he comes to Vrindavan. Therefore Chaitanya Mahaprabhu also teaches, Ramya Kachirupasana Prajavadhu Vargena Yakalpita. That mode of worship, which is executed by the gopis of Vrindavan, that is what it means to be engaged in devotional service. So we're forced to make a decision here. We have to choose either the absolute paradigm of Gopi Bhava, which seems completely beyond us at this point, or we have to find some relative exemplars or ideals that we can try to emulate. Therefore we have spiritual masters. Therefore we have Smriti Shastras. A Smriti Shastra will take these abstract and absolute principles and translate them into a ground level reality that we can begin to execute practically on a regular basis. That is necessary. But it's also relative. Because as soon as we advance beyond the benefit for which a particular instruction is aimed, then we have to give up that instruction and move on to the next level. Which is a fancy way of saying that when we endeavor to surrender to Krishna, what does he do? He raises the bar so that you have to endeavor even more. And I hate to disappoint you, but it goes on like this forever. So get used to it. There was one Hindi poet who wrote a poem called Agni Desh, Fireland. And he's saying that, here I am, I'm, trying to make my way through these scorching flames and burning hot cinders and blasting dry wind and smoke and so many, and I'm just wondering, is there ever a point at which I can find some cool, limpid, tranquil pond and dive deep and soothe my parched throat and just relieve myself? And then, no. The answer is no. On the other side of this fire, there's more fire, and there's more fire, and more hot winds, and more blasting cinders and smoke, and oh my God, what am I going to do? So he says, at what point do I gain any relief from the burning pain of this fire? And I don't know what he had in mind when he wrote this poem, frankly, because it was a secular poet, but the way that I interpreted it is this, that on the other side of all this fire, there's only more fire. So how do we get relief from the burning that this fire causes us? You have to become fire. You have to become fire. Then you will not be burned anymore. So we are constantly identifying with the mundane mind, with the mundane body. For that reason only, devotional service seems as if it's something foreign to us, seems as if it's something unattainable to us, even unpleasant for us. After all, most of us here did not take birth in Vrindavan because we wanted the facilities that are available outside of Vrindavan. Or we wanted the support of a society that would condone our own mentality, which is different from that of the gopis of Vrindavan. We're back to this absolute paradigm again. So everything else in devotional service, you'll find Krishna also explains in Canto 11. It's all relative. In the sense, our existentialist friends are correct when they inform us that the only absolute is that there's no absolute. In this limited sense, that's actually true. But there is an absolute truth. It's prema bhakti. It's prema bhakti. And for the rest of us, as long as we are endeavoring to take baby steps in that direction, then there are some vidhis are given in the Shastras, and the spiritual master will give us a particular instruction or engage us in a particular way, but it must be understood that if we have the essential spirit of progressive advancement in Krishna consciousness, the spirit that Prabhupada is emphasizing in the beginning of his purport here, it should be understood that that should impel us to keep moving more and more and more and more. Keep moving. I told someone the other day, there was a funny quote from Winston Churchill, who should know. He said, if you're going through hell, keep going. So devotional service is, sometimes it's difficult in the beginning. Usually it's difficult. And for many reasons, infinite reasons. And good reasons also. But a good excuse is still an excuse. If we want to adopt this line, we should understand it's a very high standard. It is the highest standard. It is the standard that was set by the gopis. And nothing else is really something we should be settling with, ultimately. Everything else we should be ready to discard as we advance further. Under the direction of the bona fide guru, and the Shastras, and the Guru Parampara. That's the important qualification that we have to consider. Now the verses here from Bhagavad Gita have been quoted also by Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur. Srila Prabhupada has very faithfully represented those. Same thing holds with this Atmanamash Munayo verse, that even when we are liberated, this is a point that's very carefully made by the Acharyas in their commentaries here, even if we are liberated, we still have to perform devotional service. So what does it mean that we should be attached to giving up the goal? Uparameta yogat, it's said here. You should also give up your yoga practice. Yoga means the process of joining. If you're already joined, then there's no need for the process of joining anymore. But that does not mean that the activities of devotional service, pure devotional service, are ever given up, even though they are also our means. Because we should always remember, devotional service is both the means and the ends. The goal and the abhideya and the prayojan, in some sense, they're the same thing. The means and the ends are the same. And that's not true of other processes. Just like brahmacharya. Throughout the Shastra, the process of brahmacharya is very highly considered and encouraged. But it's not an eternal process. When one has when one has come to the liberated stage, then it's no longer required. And that's what's being discussed here. Of course, especially in this Kali Yuga, maybe we should not try to discourage that too much. And in fact, it's very difficult to discourage any of the vidhis that are given in the Shastras for the same reason. Because we have a hard enough time trying to follow something. You can come to the point of sarva dharman parijajya once you come to the point of sarva dharman parigrahya. When you can embrace all the dharmas, then you can reject all the dharmas. If you do not even have the adhikar to embrace the dharmas, then where's the question of rejecting them? So in most cases, all cases, virtually, I think it's safe to say that we're all just depending on mercy. Because nobody in this Kali Yuga, we know the qualifications. We have short lives, we're unlucky, we're always disturbed, we're lazy, we don't have any good intelligence, so many things. We really have no assets. What does Sanatana Goswami say in this beautiful prayer? Anyone who knows nectar of devotion very well should recognize what is the example he gives for this state that we call ashabanta. It's one of the anubhavas. Na prema shravanadi bhaktirapiva yogo thava vaishnavo. He says, I don't have prema. I don't even have any real attachment to the process of developing that prema, namely shravanam kirtanam ityadi. And he says, yogo thava vaishnavo. I'm not a devotee. I've never practiced yoga. What is the next line? Jnanam va shubha karma va kyataho sajjatirapyasti va. He says, I've never done any pious activities. I've not cultivated jnana. I don't even have a good birth. Sanatana Goswami did have a good birth. He was born in a Saraswat Brahmin family. That's one of the best births that you can get in this world. I can say that I didn't have a good birth, and everything else that he's already said up until now. So he says, I'm completely cut off, and I've got no means of access. We discussed this earlier. This is how I feel. I have no means in this world that might elevate me towards you, Krishna. So what am I going to do? Hey Gopi Jana Vallabha Vyatayate Ha Ha Madashairamam. I can just hope against hope, and I can call out your name and cry out for help. And this is what we do when we chant. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. By this simple process, we will become elevated to the stage of piety, because it's punya shravana kirtana. And we will attain the fruit of situation within piety, which is adhikar for Brahman realization. And when we attain that Brahmabhuta platform, then we can actually practice real devotional service. So you have to be very careful, as he says here in this verse. Prabhupada translates it as careful. Apramata means unbewildered. Prabhupada twice translates it as very careful. In other words, bandho mui savadhana mate. Same idea. You have to follow this thing very carefully and patiently and enthusiastically and according to the principles, etc., as Rupa Goswami has advised us. So the order of the spiritual master is not something that we give up, and the process of bhakti, that those things that generate prema, that is to say, those also we don't give up. So what we're giving up when we're talking about desisting from the means, there's only those corollary processes that are not intrinsic to bhakti. Those things that are meant to favorably produce bhakti. And even those things, for most of us, we've got to be very careful about giving them up as well. because the general tendency I mentioned in the beginning, the Sahajya tendency, that is to say, is to assume that we've advanced much farther than we actually have. So there's much, much more that we can say here. There's a verse that Srila Prabhupada quotes twice in his purport from the 4th canto. So I'm just going, I would not be able to conscionably ignore that verse. I'll just read the translation and mindful of the fact that it's getting late. But it's notable that Prabhupada refers us to that verse twice in his purport, even though none of the predecessor acharyas have mentioned it in theirs. So we should hear.